Hello, good to see you. At the moment when the Israeli Prime Minister is visiting India, the Ministry of External Affairs is holding a press brief. Let's take a look.
And I think that all of you who saw the television shots would have understood the warmth of the relationship and the personal chemistry that the two leaders enjoyed. This was evident at the airport. This was evident at the event to rename Teen Murti Chowk as Teen Murti Haifa Chowk. It was also evident in the fact that the Prime Minister gave a private dinner for the Prime Minister of Israel and Mrs. Netanyahu, as well as in the very warm and friendly meeting that the External Affairs Minister had with Prime Minister Netanyahu yesterday. Prime Minister Netanyahu told our Prime Minister and others that he was very moved by the events and the renaming of Teen Murti Chowk as Teen Murti Haifa Chowk. Our Prime Minister underscored that this is the centenary year of the event in which a number of Indian soldiers fell at the Battle of Haifa. And it was therefore with a great sense of appreciation that the Prime Minister of Israel and Mrs. Netanyahu attended that event at the Teen Murti Haifa Chowk. Yesterday, the first meeting was with the External Affairs Minister in the evening. It was a very warm meeting. External Affairs Minister had met Prime Minister Netanyahu, who is also the Foreign Minister of Israel, when she went there in January 2016, and they picked up the threads of the conversation from that meeting, and a number of issues were discussed on the bilateral front. This morning, the Prime Minister, we had the ceremonial reception at Rashtrapati Bhavan, but the morning began with a restricted meeting between the two Prime Ministers. And then this was followed by delegation-level talks. I'm sure all of you have seen the joint statement which captures the essential elements of what was discussed, but I would just like to highlight a few things that were discussed between the two Prime Ministers. The first important area included strengthening of bilateral cooperations in 3 or 4 key sectors. This included agriculture, in particular science and technology, also defense and security. Secondly, a number of issues were discussed in new areas that the two countries are planning to move into. This includes the oil and gas sector and cyber security. There was also a discussion on how to facilitate the flow of people through connectivity, through improvement of visa systems, and so on. And in this context, both Prime Ministers, and particularly our Prime Minister, emphasized that our relationship with Israel has moved beyond merely a G2G agreement. It is actually a people-to-people relationship, and that the new technologies that are now available should be used to strengthen this relationship. And I think Prime Minister Netanyahu himself underscored on more than one occasion that Israel has been at the cutting edge of technologies which affect the lives of people, and that Israel is ready to cooperate with us in all these areas. One of the areas in which Prime Minister Netanyahu laid particular emphasis was agriculture. He actually discussed with Prime Minister a number of new technologies which actually reach the farmer directly in terms of whether it is water to the plant, whether it is fertilizers to the plant, when to cut the crop, the use of big data in agriculture to improve productivity and to enhance yields. A number of issues were discussed, and the Agriculture Minister, the Union Agricultural Minister, was also present during the meeting. It was decided that both countries will work jointly in these areas to see how we can apply the new technologies that Israel has to improve agriculture in India. Water, of course, was another big subject for discussion. Israel has some important technologies in use of water, in conservation of water, in purification of water, and we agreed that these were areas in which we would also work. Science and technology was an important issue that was discussed. The fund that was announced by the two Prime Ministers in Tel Aviv when Prime Minister went in July has now been operationalized. Both sides have put in the requisite amount of funds, $20 million on each side, and we have sent out the call for proposals. We also, there's a discussion on innovation and startups. The business event, which is going to be held later this evening, will pick up on this theme, because the principal theme of the CEOs Forum and the business event is innovation as a bridge between India and Israel. One of the interesting new features which also figures in the joint statement is the decision for us to exchange youth, 100 young people each year, in the areas of science and technology, in order to popularize among youth what the two countries are doing in science and technology. Another area which I would like to mention in the joint statement is also a decision by the Ministries of Science and Technology to have a symposium for women in STEM areas, science, technology, and mathematics. And again, this was something which was emphasized as a P2P rather than a G2G indicator of the relationship. On the investment side, both Prime Ministers felt that much more could be done on the trade front, given the fact that our trade figures are roughly around $4 billion US dollars. The Prime Minister spoke of the reforms, and he particularly emphasized that if we are to give comfort to investors, we need to conclude a bilateral investment treaty as soon as possible. Those negotiations, of course, are underway. 4 agreements have been signed. The details are in the joint statement. But in addition to the 4 G2G agreements, 2 semi-government-to-government agreements were signed. The signatories on our side were ministries or entities of the Government of India. One was Ayush with regard to homeopathy research. The second was on space research. And 3 letters of intent were signed, one between the Invest India and Invest Israel, and 2 more in the energy field, metal air batteries and solar thermal related technologies. Now, after this meeting with the Prime Ministers, the Prime Minister of Israel will call on Rashtrapati Ji this evening. There will be the CEO event and the business forum. The Israeli delegation includes a very large business component, and they are very hopeful that during the course of this visit, we can get more investment, we can have greater trade deals, and the business event that is taking place today, which culminates in the 2 Prime Ministers delivering remarks or addressing the business event, is expected to enhance that part of the bilateral relationship. A number of the views were exchanged by the External Affairs Minister on a number of regional issues, as is normally the practice, regional and multilateral issues. I think the 2 Prime Ministers are extremely pleased with the outcome of their talks. That was evident in the press statements that they issued earlier this afternoon. Prime Minister Netanyahu has said he is looking forward to his forthcoming visit to Gujarat and to Mumbai. But of course, he will go before that on a private visit to Agra tomorrow. And he will also be addressing the Raisina dialogue as the keynote or inaugural speaker. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you, sir. There are 2 documents which we have already put on the website. The first, as Secretary mentioned, is the joint statement, and we have also put out the list of MOUs and agreements which we have signed. Smita?
Smita Sharma from the Tribune. 2 quick questions. So one is on the spike deal, can you give us some clarity? Because there have been contradictory reports, whether it's on the table, it's off the table. If it's off the table, what's the prime reason behind it, if that came up for discussions? And B, how does India plan to take forward its traditional position of the support to the 2-state solution to the Palestinian conflict? How did that figure in talks?
Well, on defense cooperation, it was, of course, discussed between the 2 leaders, and the joint statement reflects that discussion. I'm obviously not at liberty to go into the details of that discussion, but suffice to say that where individual defense procurement is concerned, the relevant matters are discussed by officials. This is not normally done during a high-level visit. As far as the issue of Palestine is concerned, yes, it was discussed. Yes, it is true that the Israeli side expressed its position. And our side explained that we had made clear our own position, both on the status of Jerusalem and on Palestine. What the two sides agreed was that our relationship was much larger than any single issue, that we need to look at it holistically. And while we continue to talk to each other, our relationship is not determined by this single issue.
Aditya?
Mr. Gokhale, the question is about in how much detail was the discussion on terror? We obviously heard Benjamin Netanyahu speak about condemnation of terror. He mentioned Mumbai 26/11 attack, and we do know that he'll be visiting Mumbai. But in how much detail was it discussed, Threadbare? Thank you.
Well, time was obviously a constraint, so a number of topics had to be covered. But of course, both India and Israel share a similarity of approach on the handling of terrorism, on the fact that we will not tolerate terrorism in any form and substance. It's been reflected in quite a substantial paragraph in the joint statement. But essentially, both Prime Ministers agreed that it is necessary for us to cooperate, for us to work together to deal with the menace of terrorism. And in any case, there are various other mechanisms we have with Israel, besides at various levels to talk about this issue.
Vinita?
So can you elaborate discussion on the cyber security? What are the areas we are converging on, and what can we look forward to?
Well, this is a new area of our for collaboration, and therefore the MOU which has been signed essentially is the start of that process. Hereafter, the two sides will meet and discuss the way forward. Bala, would like to say something on the MOU?
Yeah, this is basically sharing of information and tools, and then to these kind of areas, basically, this MOU.
Well, yeah, it's a little bit more than that. They're also looking, because so far the exchanges have been between India and Israel have been much more in the B2B area as far as cybersecurity is concerned. We have many cybersecurity companies from Israel, which are amongst the best in the world, represented here in India. Now this is getting into the G2G cooperation. So there will be cert-to-cert cooperation, there will be cooperation on training and assisting on both sides. So this is the areas that we're going to start getting into, as Secretary said. Thank you.
It did figure quite prominently in discussions between the two Prime Ministers, so they both attach importance to the subject.
Akhileshji?
So as you are talking about lots on agriculture and water, but we didn't see any agreement on agriculture and water. So what was discussed and what is the outcome?
This is a subject we have been cooperating on for many years, and the two countries have established 25 centers of excellence across various parts of India. The two Prime Ministers are going to visit one of the centers of excellence in Vadrad in Gujarat, which is specifically devoted to fruits and vegetables. And from that, during that visit, they are going to remotely, through video conferencing, inaugurate a second center of excellence, which is in Bhuj, on date palms. So essentially, we have now operationalized 20 of the 25 centers. The remaining 5 have to be operationalized. And what the two Prime Ministers therefore discussed now was to move beyond these centers of excellence and to look at ways in which we could use technology, particularly big data, as well as sensors on the ground, for instance, in improving crop yields and in giving information to the farmer through the use of big data, sensors and satellite technology to enhance yields. So it was, in a sense, going beyond simply setting up institutions to using technology to bring it straight to the farmer. And in this regard, they decided that we will have a meeting at the official level hereafter to concretize how these technologies can be used to help the farming community.
And on water?
On water, of course, the focus was essentially on if you remember when Prime Minister went to Israel, Prime Minister Netanyahu showed him a mobile vehicle for purification and desalination of water. So essentially building on that, we are looking at ways in which we can collaborate to take this on a much larger scale. That particular vehicle will be gifted by the Prime Minister of Israel to the Prime Minister of India. And a number of other areas in which we can help in water in terms of drip irrigation and so on is what is going to be looked at. Not yet.
Sridharji, please use the mic. Sridhar and then followed by the gentleman there.
So I have a small clarification. I'm Sridhar from the Asian Age. I have a small clarification to ask on Smita's question. Would you be able to give us a direct answer whether the spike deal was actually discussed between the two prime ministers? And my question is, there's been a rather brief reference to terrorism in the joint statement, and Pakistan has not been named. So is it because of a divergence in the way we look at terrorism and the way they look at it, in the sense that they view Iran as an epicenter of terrorism, whereas we view Pakistan as being so? So is it why Pakistan was not named in the statement?
Well, to answer the second question first, I think there's absolutely no divergence in the positions of the two countries. It's not necessary each time to name countries, but I think the sense of that paragraph is very clear, and I would like to read it. Both sides refer not only to terror organizations, but those who sponsor, encourage, or finance terrorism or provide sanctuary to terrorists and terror groups. I think the meaning is quite clear. On the first question, as I explained, as I said earlier, we did discuss defense cooperation, but I am not at liberty to disclose any further details on this.
So, Ritu Parna from CNBC TV 18, we have been discussing a free trade agreement for quite some time now. How will this be taken forward? We expected some statement on that. Secondly, on defense cooperation, joint ventures between Indian and Israeli companies already exist. We have Punj Lloyd, we have other companies like Kalyani setting up joint ventures, setting up factories actually. But there are no orders as of now. So how will these joint ventures now be taken forward as there is no clarity on how the Indian MOD will give them orders?
On the free trade agreement, it is a fact that the Prime Minister of Israel did raise this during the discussions. Our Prime Minister conveyed that a delegation will be going to Israel shortly. I understand a delegation from the Department of Commerce will actually go next month for discussions on trade. As far as the second question is concerned, Prime Minister did explain that he had taken a number of reforms for Make in India in the defense sector. But as to what on the second part of your question, I think it should be directed to the Ministry of Defense. The Ministry of External Affairs cannot answer that.
Kalol, Mr. Venkat, and Ramesh.
Mr. Gokhale, it's nice to see you here. And my question is about the issue of big data that you have referred to twice in your presentation so far. I wish to know, how do we plan to work on this with Israel at a time when, Aadhaar is being discussed in such a vigorous manner in India? And secondly, are there safeguards that you have in place to share this sort of, huge database that we have currently?
I once again request to follow the one question rule, otherwise we will be at the liberty of ignoring one. Mr. Venkat.
Mr. Gokhale, Mr. Netanyahu has said in an interview last night that two reasons are responsible for, speeding up of relations between the two countries. One is the FTA. Of course, you answered that partially. The other one is bureaucracy. Would you like to say something about that? Why does bureaucracy get into this, and does it actually lead to the delaying of things happening? Thanks.
So far as the bureaucracy is concerned, I think you heard I don't know whether you were there at the press conference earlier this afternoon, during which our Prime Minister referred to the statement made by the Prime Minister of Israel when he went on the visit about the difficulties being faced by the Prime Minister of Israel with regard to the bureaucracy. But essentially, the message that both Prime Ministers said was that we will take this relationship forward regardless. That's the kind of importance they attach. With regard to the question on big data, I will limit myself to the subject on hand, and since it is not my place to speak about Aadhaar. I think the idea of big data was brought into the discussion by the Israeli side in the context of emphasizing how technology can now be used to agglomerate vast amounts of information and then bring it to bear on an individual field or an individual farmer's efforts. And whether that is in water utilization, for the ideal time for cutting a crop, what should be planted in that area, the soil conditions was one of the issues that was mentioned actually. So it is an application of big data information in terms of improving yields. As I said, this was the idea that was discussed today. The specifics have to be discussed when the agriculture ministries meet, and we will plan that meeting soon.
Ramesh and then Pranay.
Thank you, Mr. Gokhale. You mentioned about regional and multilateral issues came up for discussion. Could you give us a sense of what those issues were? I mean, did either side raise, for instance, the issue of Iran, Syria, Iran nuclear deal, for instance? Thank you.
Mr. Gokhale, there was a mention in the joint statement regarding the concerns of Indian caregivers in Israel. What is the issue and what addressal India is looking at through the bilateral agreement with Israel on this issue?
I will request my colleague, the ambassador, to talk about the caregivers issue. On the question of regional and multilateral issues, a number of issues were discussed. We discussed the situation in West Asia. We discussed UN-related issues. There was a brief discussion on the reform of the United Nations Security Council. There was no discussion on the Iran nuclear deal in a specific manner. I think the Indian government's position in any case is quite clear on that. Pavan, maybe on the caregivers.
Thank you, sir. We have about 11 to 12,000 Indian caregivers working in Israel. They all go there on their own through the market mechanism, as it were. What we have found is that they are often getting into issues before they move here. They get exploited by agents and others at this end, and then sometimes they're open to similar, issues on the other end. So we are trying to see if we can have an arrangement or an agreement by which these issues are dealt with and it's regulated in a certain manner. The Israeli Supreme Court has actually mandated and told the Israeli government that they should be doing this for caregivers coming from all countries. So we're just working with them and trying to formalize it in a way to try and remove that. Nothing more than that. Thank you.
Production of films between India and Israel. Can you just give us the details? And films between India and Israel. Can you just give us the details? And can you expect Indian actors to act in Israeli films with Indian help? Indian government's help?
My question is on defense cooperation again. Did the Israeli side show any interest in making investment in India under the Make in India program? Any specific project under discussion?
I'll request my colleague to speak about the film co-production. As far as investments in the defense sector are concerned, there are already investments in the defense sector. Israeli companies have already invested. It is certainly our hope, and this hope was expressed by Prime Minister today, that more companies will come in and that the outcome of this will be transfer of technology to India. And in that regard, Prime Minister did explain what new steps were being taken to encourage industries to come. Beyond that, individual investments are not discussed at such meetings, but I presume these will be discussed at the business event by the business communities of both countries. Perhaps Bala, you could speak about the film co-production MOU.
Yeah, basically this MOU is, this is a new beginning in the production of films and techniques, and then various places, and then some jointly produce new themes. So this is a It's only beginning of the cooperation in this arena. It's basically exploratory in nature, and then based on that, it will help both the countries to come up with certain specialized areas in this film production. Thank you.
I just wanted to add here that the Prime Minister of Israel himself on a number of occasions expressed that he was looking forward to his visit to Mumbai. And interesting anecdote was that during the lunch or the banquet which the Prime Minister hosted a short while ago, one of the music items played by the live band was Ichak Dana, Pichak Dana. The number of Israelis who knew that was amazing. In fact, they all instantly turned around and said, oh, we know this song and it's very popular in Israel. So I think that films would be a good way of building that people-to-people relationship.
We are running short of time, so I'll take the last two questions. Naima and, okay, the gentleman there.
I'm Iftikhar Gilani from DNA newspaper. Since you mentioned the joint statement also, and the Prime Minister also mentioned here, the Prime Minister also mentioned about the people-to-people contacts and strengthening the people-to-people contacts. What I want to know whether there was a mention about convincing Israel to give a right to pilgrimage for the religious tourism, because the city of Jerusalem is sacred to the large population in India, with the Muslims and as well as the Christians.
Naima.
Sir, on the bilateral investment treaty, any sort of discussions, when it will be concluded, when is the next round of talks, and whether it will be discussed within the framework of the free trade agreement? Thank you.
To take the second question first, what was essentially discussed today was a decision by both sides to move towards a bilateral investment treaty. I understand that one round of discussions has already been held. A second round will be held shortly. But it is not within the ambit of any trade arrangement. The idea was to put in place an arrangement which gives comfort to investors. To Israeli investors in India and presumably to Indian investors abroad. With regard to the first question, what was discussed was facilitating visits between the two countries, whether it is in improvements in visas or improvements in connectivity, or in other ways of helping people move between the two countries. Obviously, the specific issues that you raised were not discussed, but I would like my colleague, if he has to add anything to this, our ambassador.
Just to say that as far as we're concerned, there is no stoppage, no ban on any religious pilgrimage, to Jerusalem, whether it's Christians or Muslims. That all is completely open, and the vast majority of Indian tourists who go to Israel are basically for pilgrimage purposes, primarily from Kerala. Thank you.
With this, we come to the end of this special press briefing on the visit of the Prime Minister of Israel to India. Thank you all for joining, and thank you, Secretary, thank you, Ambassador, and JS Wana for speaking to the media. Please have a good evening. Thanks.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
This was the press briefing after the first day of official meetings between the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who is currently on a 6-day visit to India. Today he's in New Delhi. Tomorrow he will travel on a personal visit to Agra. Much to discuss: agriculture, weapons, people-to-people relations, the role in Bollywood, and a lot more.